Welcome back for today's election prediction video where I want to go over the governor's race in the state of Georgia. It's a fascinating situation here in what's traditionally a more Republican-leaning state, but in terms of the southeastern states, Georgia's definitely closer to becoming more of a purple state than other similar states in the region like Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina, for instance. So I'm going to go through a bunch of different information about this governor's matchup and then give my final prediction at the end of the video. So starting off here, looking at the Cook political report, and this is a Republican-held seat. It's not an incumbent situation, and they currently have Georgia labeled in the toss-up category. And it's not a big surprise to see this because when we go over to the polling that's been done, not an overwhelming number of polls for this race, but as you can see here, with the three polls that we have, the most recent one was a tie 45-45 between the Democrat Stacey Abrams and Republican Brian Kemp. The poll before that had Abrams ahead by 2, and then one poll prior to that had Kemp ahead by 2. So when you average them all together, it's a 45-45 tie. So very close in the polling numbers that we've been getting in this governor's matchup. I think the fact that the Democrats are running an African-American as well as a woman should help them in their chances at trying to close this Republican gap that there still is in the state of Georgia. In this midterm year, this isn't a presidential year, so there isn't going to be quite the turnout that we saw, for instance, in 2016, and that allows it to where the Democrats potentially have maybe a little bit more of a chance because there's more enthusiasm on their side. And if that African-American vote comes out in strong numbers, then that can push Abrams over the top. Kind of think of the situation that we had over in Alabama with Doug Jones going on and upsetting that Senate race. It was because the African-American vote turned out very strongly for Doug Jones. And when you have less turnout than what you would get, for instance, in a presidential year, that can allow you to get these upset situations. But I wouldn't even know if it would be considered all that big of an upset because the polls are so close in this instance. So I got a few more numbers that I want to go over as well. We look back at the 2014 gubernatorial election in the state of Georgia, and it was relatively competitive. The Democrat Jason Carter coming up short, though, losing it by about 8 percentage points, a couple hundred of thousands of votes. And Georgia is just a really interesting state. It's continuing to keep its slight majority of Republican voters in comparisons to the Democratic voters in the state, but that is changing because the demographics of the state are continuing to get more diverse in what's already a very diverse state. And also having a major metropolitan city like Atlanta and the suburbs around Atlanta, which continue to gain in population as more people are coming and moving around these city centers in comparison to the rural parts of the state, that has a liberalizing effect on voters. And we're seeing around the city of Atlanta, white suburban voters, for instance, are becoming a bit more Democratic, which is also making things a bit more competitive in Georgia. So I got some more numbers I want to go over here. We look at the primary results in Georgia. And I always say whenever Democrats can keep the total voting number in primaries close, that means that they should be able to maybe even have an advantage, or at the very least anyways, keep things close on election day. So we see here in that Democratic primary, we had about 553,000 votes in total. Stacey Abrams running away with it in convincing fashion. And then on the Republican side, they had 607,000 votes. So a difference here of a little over 50,000 votes in the advantage to the Republicans. But again, your typical Democratic voter isn't as likely to turn out in primaries in comparison to your typical Republican voter. So not bad numbers by any means for the Democrats, especially in a state like Georgia. So moving on from those primary numbers, I also just wanted to show you the ethnic situation in the state of Georgia. I don't love focusing on racial makeups of regions, but that has an effect, obviously, so it is worth talking about. Georgia is one of the most heavily populated African-American regions of the United States. They have the most if we look at the top list here in terms of number of African Americans that live in the state, but in terms of percentage, over 31% of Georgia is that African American vote. So considering that African Americans in the state of Georgia vote for Democrats at about a 90% clip, that is very favorable for their chances if they can get strong turnout amongst that base. And considering they're running an African-American woman on the ticket, I think that that's going to have a big motivating factor for a lot of these voters and potentially could push Abrams over the line and pick up this victory. And I also want to take a look at recent presidential results where we're getting a fairly static situation in Georgia, but it is slightly decreasing. So in 2016, Hillary Clinton losing by about 5 percentage points. In 2012, Obama lost by about 8 points. And then in 2008, also kind of a similar situation, losing by about 7 points. So in the last 3 presidential elections, the Democrats have gotten it relatively close. But again, it's been a pretty fairly static result right in that about 5 to 8 percentage point range, which is very similar to what we had in the 2014 gubernatorial race, which was the last midterm election that we had, where the Democratic challenger lost by about 8 percentage points. So although the demographics are closing in the state of Georgia, and it's a competitive enough state where if you get very strong turnout on the Democrat side, they could end up picking up the win, which is why, again, this is listed as a toss-up. The polling has been so close. So my final prediction on this one, I'm really torn. You can make a solid case going either way, but just the fact that these statewide elections over the past decade have been relatively static, where the Republicans have been able to win in those single-digit margins between about 5 and 8 percentage points. Even with poor turnout, they could still end up winning by 1 or 2 percentage points and still grabbing the victory. Again, even in a best-case scenario for the Democrats where they get very strong support and voter turnout on Election Day. So with that being the case, it's going to be really close, but I'm slightly siding with Brian Kemp and the Republicans. But again, this is going to be one that we keep an eye on, certainly on Election Day, because it's one of the most fascinating races that we're going to have to look at. So that's going to wrap up this video, guys. Thanks for stopping on in. Subscribe for more. I hope to see you back here for future videos.